According to Ephesians 5:32, marriage in the context of Christian faith is the gospel on display. The gospel on display. In Ephesians 5, very well known passage, verses 21 through 33, talking about how does all this that we believe about Jesus lived out in a marriage context. And we've looked at these verses before, and we'll look at them again. But today we're just going to focus on verse 32. Verse 32 of Ephesians chapter 5 says, "This is a profound mystery." What's he talking about? Well, all these things he just said about husbands loving your wife as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for it. Wives, be submissive to your husbands as unto the Lord. Um, Husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. Um, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two shall become one. All of these things. And then he says in verse 32, this is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. I'm not just talking about a man and a woman, a husband and a wife, an earthly, physical union in marriage. There is that, and that is a beautiful thing, but it's not the most beautiful thing. There is that, and it's not the most important thing, even though it is a very important thing. Paul is saying God has designed marriage for many reasons and purposes, which we've already talked about. But the overall, the umbrella that covers all of the other purposes, the overarching purpose is to give a picture, is to display the love of Christ for his bride. It's to demonstrate this relationship that we, the church, the bride of Christ, has with our Savior, with our Redeemer, with our groomsman, with our groom. And so, what kind of a marriage do you have? Do you have a marriage, and do I have a marriage where people look and they say, wow, I'm looking at something different there than just the normal husband-wife thing that we know in our culture. I'm looking at something here that makes me want to know more about God. I'm looking at something here in this relationship that makes me hungry to know Jesus. I'm looking at the fact of the matter is, even if you're coming from a faith-based perspective, which I know some of you are who are watching this, half of you that are watching this, your marriages are going to end in divorce. And it's a crushing, heartbreaking thought, because that is so far from what God has in mind for you. That is so far from what God designed marriage for. That is so far from what will bring health and healing and wholeness and richness to relationships in our family and in our churches and in our communities. God has something better in plan. And it's important for us to remember that if all we think about, and this is what our culture tells us, how do you feel? What are you getting out of it? You're important. Our marriage, as God designed it, is about way more than us. It's way more than about me. It's way more than about my wife and me. It's about Christ. It's about attention being drawn to him. It's about God getting the glory. And so I just want to encourage us today. That's another perspective to consider when we think about marriage. It's not about how can I get out of this what makes me feel good, or how can I get my partner to do what I think they need to do. It's about how can we together, two becoming one, exemplify the holy triune God who has given himself for us, who is sacrificed so that we can enter into an eternal love relationship with him? That's really a good question for us to consider as we leave this topic today. How can my marriage this week further exemplify and greater glorify the God of the gospel and the gospel of our God? We'll see you on the next edition of Marriage Matters with McCracken.